Hello, everybody, and welcome to the ISTAT Learning Lab. Today, we're going to again talk about the path to recovery, but this time we're going to get the perspective from Brazil, from Embraer. Last week, we had Bob Lange from Airbus giving his perspective. And now it's the turn of Rodrigo Silva e Sousa, who is head of marketing and strategy for Embraer Commercial Aviation. Rodrigo is the head of marketing and strategy, yes, for Embraer, and he is responsible for market forecast, strategic planning, and new product development and sales engineering. Rodrigo has been with Embraer for 23 years, and he started as product development engineer in the Embraer 145 program. And later he moved to market intelligence department, where he performed several different roles. As director of product strategy, he led product positioning and marketing activities during the early development stages of the Embraer 170 and 190 series, and then on the E2. Rodrigo is also responsible for managing Embraer's roadmap of future products and market forecasts in commercial aviation. Before I hand over to Rodrigo, I just wanted to mention that we have learning labs coming up in the next 3 weeks, first on the 25th of May, and then on the 1st of June, and then on the 9th of June. And please check in at istat.org online for more information and details and registration. During this presentation by Rodrigo today, you can write in questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I will monitor those questions and bring them up to Rodrigo if we have time at the end of his session. Please don't use the chat button, use the Q&A button, okay? And with that, I hand over to Rodrigo in Brazil.
Thank you very much, Niels. Very nice to be with you here. Thank you very much to ISTAT for the opportunity of the presentation. Let me share my screen here. Okay, I hope you all can see the screen.
Perfect.
Yeah. Thank you, Nils. So what I'm gonna bring you today is the is a little bit of the perspective about the market, about the recovery, and about long-term trends going forward, specifically for the market up to 150 seats, which is the core market of Embraer. So I'll be presenting how we see the impacts from COVID in general on aviation, and then I will deep dive on each specific region, talking about how we see the recovery and the structural changes that this crisis is imposing on our industry, and how it will look like in the future. So let me start by talking a little bit about the crisis. It's just a summary. Most of you are well aware of what's going on worldwide, but we had this huge impact from the coronavirus. We had several waves in different regions, each one happening at a different time, so different lockdowns, making difficult, especially for our industry, to keep the passenger flow. So it was a huge impact, and as we look forward, the rhythm of vaccination is accelerating worldwide. It's very well advanced in countries like the United States and China, but is still lagging in other regions of the world. So it's still making difficult for a segment where its core business is to connect. we see that a really let's say worldwide large number of vaccinations will be achieved more towards beginning of 2022. So this is where we should see worldwide, let's say, a stronger recovery. However, in some regions, certainly in the second half of this year, we should have already a very strong rebound of the market, especially on domestic. International on another impact of the crisis is a slowdown in international trade, and this has also caused several companies, countries, and even blocs, to reconsider their supply chain strategy. In many cases, we see leaders going public to state that they would review their supply chain strategy, let's say to be not exclusively focused on costs, but also more balanced in terms, which means typically a more nearshoring, which for the aviation sector means a strengthening of the domestic markets in comparison in relation to the international market. Another consideration is the level of debt and insolvency. This has affected, of course, the entire economy, but especially for the airlines and for some countries, for some companies in the aviation sector, the availability of credit became much more difficult, more expensive, and this for sure will somehow compromise let's say the recovery, the ability of airlines to recover and grow again. Finally, but not less important, we have the inequality, unequal, let's say, impact from COVID on the different levels of income population. So we have seen in the past and before the pandemic a strong growth coming from the rise of a middle class, especially in the underdeveloped countries, especially in Asia. And what we saw with this pandemic is that the lower income population was more affected. When we look at the projection of the infection, the real, or let's say the unofficial estimate is twice or three times the number of the official cases, and most of that non-official cases are composed by cases in the lower income, the poor population. So that growth that we are seeing before will probably slow down going forward. Another characteristic of this crisis is that it affected all the regions strongly and at the same time. So in the chart at the right, we see the impact in GDP for the different regions. We had even in Asia with a smaller impact, but is still relevant, with close to 2%, up to what we saw in Latin America and Europe, close to 8%. This was this simultaneous impact in all regions has been unprecedented and has, of course, impacted the economy very strongly. When we look at the projections of GDP, of course, we had this drop in 2020, and that causes a projection going forward, of course, to have a smaller economy compared to what we had before. What we see is a persistent loss of 5% in GDP, globally speaking, which means that this will have also an impact in the growth of aviation. As we all know, there is a strong correlation between the aviation demand and economic growth. So we can see the size of the impact in the aviation industry in this chart. I used to have this chart actually to show how resilient has been the industry along the years. So we have all the crises, and when having a long-term perspective, we can see that the drops were relatively small. Even in the strongest crisis, the smallest drop we had in global RPK was 1.8% during the 9/11 attacks. In 2020, we had around 60% decline. This was the industry for sure was not prepared for that. And this different level of impact is what takes us to believe that this will cause structural changes worldwide, of course, in all sectors, but particularly in aviation. We believe that the industry will have to go to what some are calling the Great Reset. Now, looking specifically on evolution of demand for aviation, this chart shows the evolution of revenue passenger kilometer, a projection, a 10-year projection. Of course, we see this drop in 2020, and in the next 5 years, let's say we see a period of recovery. So some regions are expected to recover, let's say in 2022. Actually, some are in the domestic market, for instance, may be done already in 2021. But in other cases, we see that the recovery will take until 2024 to happen. And even after the recovery is completed, even after we achieve the same levels of 2019, what we believe is going to happen is, because of the economic impact, because of the lower economic growth, aviation also will go lower compared to the previous projection. It will still grow, however, growing at a lower pace than before. So in our 10-year projections, we estimate a drop in by 20% compared to what was our previous projection for 10 years. So what are the structural changes that we anticipate as of now? Of course, there will be more for sure. I'm sure there are others that I'm not capturing here. But I would like to talk to you about 4 main ones we see impacting aviation going forward. So this is not about recovery. This is about a structural change. So first is right sizing. We see that because of two elements. One is because the industry is smaller. So if before we had a much higher growth driving bigger and bigger aircraft, here we'll probably see airlines adapting their fleet, reviewing their fleet strategy to a lower demand. So this by itself is expected to drive some level of right sizing in the industry, I would say across all seat categories, but also because of the need to improve profitability. Because as we lose scale, the industry will have to look for other opportunities to to keep or improve profitability. In some cases, actually, we had already some, let's say, less than desirable results in some regions of the world. After the pandemic, the industry growing less, the industry becoming smaller, we see that becoming even more important. And one way to do that is actually to use the right aircraft size to the level of demand that you have, and perhaps have a different aircraft size to deal with variations in demand, variations in demand along the year, or in different regions, a more versatile fleet. So this is one element. The other element is regionalization. So as I mentioned about a review on the global supply chain to be more, let's say, to be more centralized, companies and countries looking for minimizing the risk of disruption like we saw during the COVID crisis. This will strengthen the domestic market, and therefore we believe the domestic aviation, let's say, should become stronger in comparison to the international. The other one is a new passenger behavior. And here we can see from many different perspectives. One is the technologies is what we are seeing right now. Some of the conferences being done remotely. I believe there will be a lot of hybrid conferences going forward, which of course impacts the level and the profile of the demand. Another element is the working from home. So many people and companies moving away from the big centers to smaller cities, and this may decentralize the passenger flow. You may lose part of the market because of the online activity. So perhaps less meetings, less conferences. On the other hand, perhaps you have more people connecting by airplanes from smaller cities to the biggest centers. Another important element, the fourth block here, is the environment. This is something that we were seeing also before the pandemic. Environment gaining importance in aviation, but now after the pandemic, after all the injection of capital done by the governments to keep the sector alive, to keep many companies alive, this will increase the influence that governments have in the sector, and this will reflect a desire from the population to have a more environmentally friendly aviation industry. So this, we believe, will affect strongly the sector going forward, and in particular aircraft decisions. For instance, one direct element is that some of the replacement could be done earlier to facilitate the introduction of a new technology aircraft. So those are the, let's say, the four big trends we see going forward. And now I will show a little bit of the view from each region, starting with North America. So in terms of growth, economic and traffic growth is, of course, already a mature market, so a moderate growth. In terms of deliveries for this particular segment, we see 1,600 deliveries, considering jets and turboprops, and let's say a relatively stable fleet in this segment. We expected that the recovery, full recovery, to happen by end of 2022, beginning of 2023. The segment of 70, 76 seats, which is traditionally, or the, let's say, the biggest regional fleet today, we see that becoming stronger. We see also some opportunities for 50-seater replacement, and due to the new level of demand, we expect also some right sizing to smaller narrow bodies. So just to exemplify some, to give you some numbers of what I'm saying. So this is a chart that shows the percentage of fleet in service for different segments. We have wide bodies as the solid gray line, the narrow bodies, the dashed gray line, and then we have the E175 here representing the regional sector. So you see that even in the worst period of the pandemic, the E175 was is still with roughly 70% of the fleet flying. And as we recover, we start to recover, it's already 94% of the fleet in service is already flying. So the regional aircraft show its importance during big demand variations. This is one element that we believe will change going forward, because airlines will probably want to be better prepared for a crisis like this. We don't need to go to this level of the pandemic that we have. I hope we don't have, but you need to be prepared. And the smaller aircraft like the 175 proved to be very useful to keep cash inflow, to keep network, to keep some level of connectivity, even in a very tough crisis like we had. In this segment, in particular, 70 to 76 seats, we see a big wave of replacement coming. So here I'm using 20 years as a forecast for replacement. So we see already in 2021 a growing number of replacements, peaking by 2024, and let's say relatively stable in 2026, 2020 until 27, and declining again. So this is a segment where we'll probably see a lot of deliveries over the next years, especially driven by replacement. Another movement that you see is the replacement of the 50-seaters, right? This was very popular beginning of the years late 90s, early 2000s. And now they are achieving the age of replacement. We had already a large number of aircraft replaced or retired actually during the pandemic, and we'll see still a large number to be replaced. Part of this fleet should be replaced by 7 or 76 seaters. Part is still to be the industry is still to find a solution, whether a new aircraft development or a change in the scope clause to allow bigger aircraft to fly. But that's an important element, because the 50-seater represents close to 40% of the regional fleet. They cover about 1,000 markets. So it's a very important element that I think the industry will need to find a solution for the replacement. And finally, I would like to talk about the fleet profile. In North America, we see a big concentration on the RJs and on the narrow bodies, a small number of turboprops and a small number of small narrow bodies. Small narrow bodies, I'm talking here about the aircraft between 100 and 100, let's say 40 seats. We believe that because of the right sizing need, this profile will change going forward with a larger number of small narrow bodies flying US. When all this combined, what we see is that the segment up to 150 seats was already getting stronger. If you look at this chart, shows the percentage of deliveries of aircraft in this segment in comparison to the total market. So we see that with some variations, but we see already a growing level. And in 2020, we had a significant number of deliveries. So this segment of up to 150 seats gaining importance in North America. In Europe, I will be brief. The market is very mature. The trend we see is the continuous growth of the low-cost carriers. However, then the danger of this growth that we anticipate is that the level of connectivity, the level of aviation service may be reduced because of that. And I would like to show some numbers about that. So this is a chart that shows the participation of seats offered by business model. Of course, the low-cost carrier grew significantly in the last 10 years. This caused the average fare to drop significantly, and the result of those two elements combined is that we have a fleet today that is much more concentrated on very large narrow bodies. This trend was accelerating until 2019, and this has caused an impact on the level of frequencies in the European market. We see a drop, let's say, on the number of markets that were served by 3 or 4 or more frequencies, which is a typical, let's say, minimum level of service, let's say, expected from 16 to 12%, and a growing number of markets with frequencies with less than one frequency per day. So this is something that we believe going forward, probably airlines will have to take a look, because as you decrease the level of service, you reduce the number of market served. This has an impact on the economic growth in general of the region, and this is not beneficial in general for the European market. So here we see an issue that probably will have to be changed, will have to be reset going forward. Another region, Africa and Middle East. So here we have less mature markets, so a little bit higher growth going forward, although the recovery should happen actually more towards 2023, 2024, right? In total, in this segment up to 150 seats, we anticipate over 300 deliveries and a growing fleet from 760 to 870 aircraft, mainly due to a right sizing. I think one of the regions where we can see already a big issue, even before the pandemic, is after Africa and Middle East, with, for instance, this chart shows level of load factor of the different regions, and here we see both Middle East and especially Africa with lower load factors than the other regions. So especially the Africa region, it really requires an increase in efficiency. And considering that it was already with a low load factor, and considering a drop in demand, this for sure will cause a big movement towards right sizing. Another way to look at is in terms of level of frequency. Here we see both Africa and Middle East, with in the case of Africa, over 60%, close to 70% of the markets with less than 1 frequency per day. In the Middle East, close to 60%. Those in other markets, like in the United States, you see less than 40%. So the level, there is a lot of space for improvement in air service in both regions. Another way to look at in the chart on the left, we have the percentage of available seat kilometers by segment. And we see that the larger aircraft with over 150 seats has by far the majority of the market, 66%. And when we look at those markets, how they are distributed, we can see that a lot of those flights done by the larger aircraft, by aircraft done with over 150 seats. This is the chart at the right. A lot of those markets have less than 130 passengers per day, which means that it would be much more efficiently flown by smaller aircraft. So we see all the elements here for a big movement towards right sizing in Africa and Middle East. China and Asia Pacific is a different story. Very high growth, of course, lower than what we had before, but is still, compared to other regions, relatively high. A high number of deliveries in this segment, up to 150 seats, over 1,600 units over the next 10 years. And we see a strong growth in this fleet going forward. Depending on the region, we'll see the recovery happening in 2023 or 2025. In some cases, this demand for these aircraft will come from the investment to improve connectivity, the investment in new airports, the improvement in infrastructure to really improve the connectivity in those countries under development. That's a big element of the growth here. China in particular has this plan of going west, developing also new markets which will require adequate aircraft to develop those markets. And we see already some movements there. We see an increasing number of operators demanding this size of aircraft. Again, I like to show some numbers to exemplify what we want to, our views of the market. So here is a comparison of United States, a mature, consolidated market in terms of number of airports and number of domestic markets and flights and number of passengers and total O&Ds, and important countries in this region, China, India, and Indonesia. So we see that the level of the number of airports still has a big potential to grow, and we see that investment coming, especially in China and India. We see the number of domestic, a big potential of growth in the number of domestic markets, especially in India and Indonesia. So there is this plan to boost regional connectivity in India, which will demand regional aircraft. And like this, we can talk about domestic flights and total O&Ds. In general, there is a big space, let's say, for growth, especially looking at this domestic regional aviation growth in Asia Pacific. Another way to look is the connectivity. Here, what we show is the percentage of airports. The chart that I'm showing here is percentage of airports with, let's say, 30 to 50 or more than 50% of connecting passengers. So in the case of the US, we have 75% of the airports have, let's say, between 30 or 50% or even more than 50% of connecting passengers. When we compare to the other countries, that is a massive difference. This is one of the views that we see going forward, a big opportunity for improvement in connectivity in those countries. And actually, we see already the movements from the governments to improve that. Another way to look at is a comparison in terms of the link between market sizes. This is the chart on the right. So in the US, we see that is more or less distributed the number of flights between large and large markets, 31%, large to medium markets, 26%, and large to small market, 32%. When we look at China, we see that by far the biggest concentration is on large to large market. That's going to change, right? As they go west, as they look for improving connectivity in the country, this connectivity of large to medium, large to small, small to small will increase, demanding smaller aircraft. Here, a zoom, let's say, specific picture on China. So really, we see a lot of concentration, a big concentration in the east part of the country, and there are over 200 airports planned to be built over the next years, and this will for sure change the profile of the fleet that we see on the right, with this big concentration on narrow bodies, on very large narrow bodies. Something that is very important for the Asia Pacific region is profitability. This is something that was already an issue before the pandemic, as we can see here, declining margins. Even with a very high growth, the margins were declining, and this was mainly driven by let's say, a negative spiral of excessive offer, reduction in yield, and reduction in profitability. This has been, of course, exacerbated by the pandemic, and this is one of the opportunities we see for resetting the fleet here to increase profitability. When I talk about profitability in the beginning, the need to right size to compensate the lower growth rate, I would say that Asia Pacific is probably the biggest example where the region will have to look at it. So although we have this decline in profitability, when we look at the backlog is still with very large aircraft. This is going to change because it's not sustainable to keep these very large aircraft coming massively to the market and producing those very low profit margins. And we are seeing actually some of the big airlines in the region going bankrupt. So again, an opportunity for resetting here. And we see already some companies moving in that direction. We are seeing an increasing number of customers looking at aircraft with smaller capacity to right size, to improve profitability, and to be more adequate to the demand going forward. This is a picture of today. 19 customers, close to 200 aircraft in service, but we see that the industry is growing exponentially. So one of the fields I would call your attention for the growth in this particular segment is in Asia Pacific. And to close the regions, Latin America, where I'm based, in terms of growth going forward, the region has been impacted severely for sure. However, we see that the recovery may happen relatively fast between 2022 and 2023. We see the potential for that. It will depend a lot on the economic recovery. And again, here, a movement that we saw already before the pandemic, we believe that will become even more important going forward. A growing number of aircraft in this segment, up to 150 seats. When we look at the projected fleet, today 430 aircraft, going forward in 10 years from now, 800 aircraft. So when I see that we are seeing this movement today already, this chart is a very good example. So it shows the percentage of frequencies done by aircraft in different seat capacities. In blue, up to 120 seats. In yellow, larger than 120 seats. In 2008, the percentage for smaller aircraft, 10%. In 2019, therefore, before the pandemic, 30%. Imagine how this will be going forward with a lower level of demand. This number will increase even more. The region, and here I'm using Brazil as an example, has developed several new markets in the last, let's say, 10 years. In yellow here, the chart on the left, we see the existing markets from 2008 to 2019, and the new markets that were developed, so even a higher number than the existing markets in 2008. And when we look at those 266 markets, the biggest part of those markets, of course, were developed with smaller aircraft, as it should be. So this is a trend that was happening before the pandemic, and when we see in the case of Brazil an increasing number of concessions on airports, improving the infrastructure, this will incentivize the connectivity. This will improve the distribution of passenger in the country, and of course we will drive even bigger participation of aircraft up to 150 seats. So when we see, let's say, the entire demand now with a view of all the regions, a quantitative view of all the regions for this particular segment, Asia Pacific and North America are expected to be the largest regions in terms of demand for this aircraft, followed by European CIS, and then Latin America, Africa, and Middle East. So this is the way we see the geographical distribution of the deliveries going forward. And when we aggregate everything, we see the demand for this segment over the next 10 years for 5,500 new deliveries, being about 4,400 jets, about 1,100 turboprops. This is mainly driven by replacement, but also a 25% of growth. And these deliveries, as I mentioned during the presentation, driven by the necessity of a reset in the industry, a strong movement of right sizing. In many cases, the direct replacement of aircraft in the same capacity, but that are getting to the age of replacement. The development of regional aviation in some places like Latin America was mentioning, but also China, India, Indonesia, and also the replacement of a smaller aircraft. And with this, I finish my presentation. I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity, and now I hand over to Niels to handle the questions.
Thank you, Rodrigo. So we have one question that relates to your plans to look at the new turboprop aircraft. Could you elaborate a little bit on, the spec and the performance improvement and the thinking behind that?
Yeah. So it's actually part of a larger plan of Embraer, right, to consolidate itself more and more as the leader of the market up to 150 seats, right? We are already, when we look at the jets, from 70 up to 150 with the E175 V1 and the E2, and then we see the next opportunity being the turboprop market, because we see that not as a high growth market, but a stable market with a low level of competition. Today we have only ATR playing in that field. We see de Havilland pausing the production, so it actually became a monopoly in that segment with an aircraft that was really designed with technology from the 80s. So when we see the opportunity to develop a new turboprop, actually we believe we can excel, we can provide benefits in all aspects compared to the current offer. We would do a bigger turboprop, so first hand, so we are talking about a family between 70 and 100 seats, so it's smaller than the aircraft available today. So this means more revenue. Also, reduced operating costs. So we see a lot of potential gains in reducing maintenance cost and also fuel burn. We would be talking at least of a 15% reduction. We see the potential of a much more sustainable aircraft, both considering a more higher fuel efficiency, but also the aircraft being designed from scratch with the circular economy in mind, much lower noise. So we see a big potential especially for replacement of the current aircraft in service.
The current turboprops, or would that also eat into the case for regional jets?
I think in some cases may offer a good potential for replacement of regional jets as well. One possibility, for instance, is the United States. As you know, we see a significant number of routes being operated in very short sectors, right? That is a strong candidate to be replaced by turboprops with a more efficient and more sustainable flight. Another important element of what we would bring to the market in use, and in particular for this case, for instance, is worth mentioning, is the comfort for passenger. In some markets, the turboprop we see that has not developed, has not achieved entirely its potential because of the current offers are very compromised in terms of space for passengers, in terms of noise, in terms of vibration. The aircraft that we would bring to the market would have the cabin that is similar to the E-Jet C2, which is already considered the benchmark in terms of passenger comfort, even compared to a 737. So this provides an opportunity for airlines to reduce a lot operating costs, and at the same time improving the passenger comfort.
Now, your willingness to launch that project, will that depend on what's going to happen at the next election in the US? Do you think?
No, we don't see actually the opportunity in the United States. We see more like upside in our business case. The biggest part of the demand for this program would come from Asia. Over 40% of the demand is projected in Asia. And in that region, we don't see any elements why it would change significantly the demand for turboprop, because we still have markets with very low level of the demand. Actually, we see markets where we'll have the development of regional airports, which should actually drive a bigger number of aircraft. So not linked to the next elections in the US, but I should say that the interest has increased a lot recently, and I think that's a result of the results of the last election.
Okay. Rodrigo, there's another question here that relates to your position as almost emerging as a monopoly in the RJ markets. I mean, is that something that is good for you, or is that something that is
we see dangerous, right? Any monopoly, it's the market you see as a potential to attract a competition, and we actually had that, right? We had in the past Fairchild Dornier, we had Bombardier, we had Mitsubishi. The issue is that it's very tough to compete in this market, right? You need to be very efficient, and you need to have a deep knowledge of how to design, build, and support aircraft in different category. It's very tough to replicate the model that Embraer has, because if you look at the larger OEM, they of course they have all the technology, they have a huge network of services and support. I'm talking about Boeing and Airbus. They don't have the cost structure to go to make a business case viable for this smaller segment. And new entrants are possible, and we watch that carefully. However, we saw in the case of Mitsubishi that just availability of capital is not enough to break into this market. You really need experience, you need the low knowledge, it takes time. So it's not easy to break it. What we do on our side is to continue to invest in the product. So we will not allow, let's say, our products to become obsolete. We continue to improve, and we'll continue to look at new technologies that can be introduced in our aircraft. As I said, the absolute end goal of Embraer is to consolidate itself as the leader in the segment up to 150 seats.
Okay. There is a question from Eric van den Berg, and he's asking, how big do you anticipate the turboprop markets to be for this product that you're thinking about? And what engine would you select?
The engines, we are talking to the engine manufacturers to see what are the offers that are on the table. We are talking about to the main OEM. So we are analyzing. I don't have an answer to one specific engine, but sure it will have a significant introduction of new technology on it to look for the efficiency that we want to achieve. And in terms of number of markets, was that the question, Nils?
Mm-hmm.
Number of markets.
No,
so
the number of aircraft.
Number of aircraft. So we are talking our 20 years forecast is about 2,000 slightly above 2,000 airplanes, and we see that by bringing an aircraft with such a level of competitiveness, we would achieve the leadership of this market. So more than 50% of this market we would be looking at for this size of airplane, for this new program.
And do you think that there would be a little electric aspect to the propulsion system?
We are evaluating. We believe that for this size stuff, we are actually looking strongly. I have meetings almost every day to look at the new propulsion system, but we see those only become viable for much smaller aircraft. 9 seats, 19 seats. I'm sure we'll see aircraft in that size with that propulsion technology, let's say within the next 5 to 10 years. But for 100-seat turboprop, we are talking about close to 1,000 nautical miles range. That is very challenging for electric technology.
And do you have any concerns that this turboprop like this could partly cannibalize the smaller regional jet market?
No, I don't see that. Today it's very segmented. Worldwide, let's say, the demand for regional jets from the turboprops, especially the case of ATR, right? And we thought that the program that tried to make the bridge, let's say, between a turboprop and a jet, which was the Q400, was not very successful in the most recent years. So it's very different, the market for turboprops. They tend to be very short routes. In many cases, the infrastructure of the airport is compromised compared to the jet where you tend to have longer routes. The only place I see potentially that happening is the United States. But I see actually the opportunity there mainly for the replacement of the 50-seater, which today still does not have a good answer.
Rodrigo, in your presentation, you mentioned that the smaller aircraft have fared less badly than the bigger airplanes, and that you also see that there is tremendous potential for the smaller aircraft in the recovery going forward. But at the same time, you talked about the big replacement market for regionals that you showed. Now, isn't there like a conflict here? I mean, don't you think that people are going to hold on to their existing regionals more than rather than ordering new ones and then postpone the scrapping of the existing ones?
Yeah, so I think in some cases, yes, Niels, I think in some cases they might hold a little bit more, a little bit longer. But then two elements. In some cases, the aircraft are achieving the age of replacement, so there is a limit to what you can extend the life. In the case of the smaller regional jets, I'm talking about 50-seater, 76-seaters. Those are achieving 20, 25 years old, is tough for those aircraft to extend too much the life of the aircraft. In the case of the 190, 195, for instance, of the case of the larger regional jets, let's say, then those fleets are younger. However, we see that a lot of the replacement will be driven by sustainability. We believe that a lot of that size of aircraft and even aircraft in the segment above will be replaced by smaller new generation aircraft too, because of the pressure from environment. In some cases, for instance, if you consider that you are flying before with A320ceo, for instance, and now you have a new level of the demand for smaller aircraft. You replace a A320ceo by a new generation jet with a smaller capacity, you can save 30 or more percent of CO2 emissions. That's a lot. That's probably the biggest source of CO2 emissions that the aviation can do nowadays. So we believe that a lot of the replacement that from one case would be delayed because of capital availability, because of the level of capital achievable by the airlines, we see that sustainability will actually play a stronger force in the replacement of those aircraft.
Rodrigo, what do you think Embraer can do and the Brazilian Export Credit Agency in terms of helping customers obtain attractive financing to buy airplanes and to rebuild the industry?
Well, in the case of Brazilian export agency, I would not be able to speak on behalf of them, but on Embraer, I can tell you that we have a active project to look at different sources of finance. Actually, we proactively are looking at capital markets and trying to build facilities that can help our customers going forward. So there is a, let's say, I would say a special effort to develop new financing, new sources of financing for our aircraft going forward, because we realize that's a key issue for new aircraft delivery. It was already last year, it is this year, and will continue for some time in the future. So there is a specific effort on that from the sales finance arm of Embraer.
Rodrigo, you had a very interesting slide early on in your presentation that showed, things that will change as a result of this crisis. A permanent impairment in the economy, growth, et cetera, et cetera. I'm reminded when I see that in every downturn that I have lived through, that there has been speculation that this time things are going to change. And then what happens then, it turns out that nothing has changed. People still want to travel, things are recovering, and 5 or 10 years later, nobody remembers what happened last time, and we're going to move on.
Yes.
Do you really think this time is different?
Yes. I think because of the level of impact we are seeing, right? As you may remember, one of my charts was showing the change evolution in RPK along, a large period of time, and during all the crises, the maximum that we had impacting the demand, in the global demand, was 1.8%. Last year we had 60%. It's a completely different. So I used to use that slide to show actually the resilience of the sector. And to be honest, Nils, we don't know what's going to happen, right? I don't think anybody actually knows what's going to happen. What I wanted to bring is the perspective that the level of impact in the world, and in particular in the aviation sector, was completely different from the previous crisis we had. And some of the elements, like a change in passenger behavior, we see that hard to come back to normal as we go forward. So is what is really going to happen? Who knows? I don't think anybody knows. But I think we have elements to say that the impact was completely different, and therefore the evolution could be also completely different.
Okay. Thanks, Rodrigo. That was very interesting. Thank you so much to all the listeners for your time, and we see you back next week on Tuesday.
Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.